Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. Silbury Hill is the largest artificial mound in Europe. It is thought to have been built over a short period of time between 2470 and 2350 BC and is one of the most intriguing monuments in the prehistoric landscape of the Avebury World Heritage Site in England. To this day, nobody can say with any certainty what its purpose and significance was to the ancient Britons. So before I attempt to unravel this mystery, let's take a closer look at this enigmatic monument. Silbury Hill stands 30 metres high and 160 metres wide, and its construction is estimated to have involved around 4 million hours of work. 500,000 tonnes of material, including gravel and clay but mostly chalk, were used in its creation, and the monument we see today was not conceived and built in one single campaign, but it was enlarged over several generations. Whether it was the same culture enlarging the monument, or perhaps different people placing their stamp on the landscape, nobody can know for sure. Over time the project became more ambitious, with huge quantities of chalk dug from the surrounding ditch to build the mound. First of all, people stripped the topsoil and stones from the ground, then a small mound of gravel a little less than 1 metre high was built. At some later stage, a ring of stakes was set out, which archaeologists believe was to define a large area, 16 metres in diameter, into which we are told that basket loads of mud and dark soils were tipped. Smaller heaps were constructed nearby, and some pits, thought to have ceremonial significance, were dug into the central mound, which were possibly cremation burials. We are told that people continued to add soil and turf and even boulders, creating a mound 35 metres in diameter and about 5 metres high. A massive enclosing ditch with an internal bank was then dug and was 100 metres in diameter. It was backfilled and recut a number of times. A series of chalk banks were apparently added to the mound, increasing its size and backfilling the ditch. A second enormous water-filled ditch and rectangular extension were built beyond it, leaving space for the chalk mound to be further enlarged. Nobody knows why Silbury Hill was built, but the experts speculate that it must have been a special place, where people gathered for events and episodes of building, but as with most ritualistic interpretations, it isn't impossible, but there is very little evidence to go on. The period it was built in did see an intense phase of building activity in the area of Avebury, when hundreds of people came together to construct a variety of monuments. As well as Silbury Hill, Avebury Henge, together with its stone circles and avenues, were built at this time. 2 large oval enclosures at West Kennet were also built out of massive timber posts, which now only survive as buried remains. The Avebury complex extends over several square miles, with impressive barrows, banks and ditches, vast enclosures, megalithic circles, and long avenues that stretch across the land. It includes the largest stone circle and the tallest man-made mound in Europe. But experts believe that the 120-foot-high Silbury Hill was not built to a grand blueprint, because of the fact that at least 3 generations of Bronze Age Britons assembled it. In fact, a study of soil, rocks, gravel and tools inside the hill show that it went through 15 distinct phases of development. It was left for so long between phases that grass would start to grow, before being recovered at a later date. Back in 2010, archaeologist Jim Leary said the creators were building the mound as part of a continuous storytelling ritual, and that the final shape of the mound may not have been important. In fact, he says that the familiar view of stepped sides and the flat top is largely the result of Anglo-Saxons and later alterations. Its true original form is certainly not what we see today. He said, "Most interpretations of Silbury Hill have, up to now, concentrated on its monumental size and its final shape. It has generally been thought to be a concerted effort of generations of people building something out of a common vision and spiritual zeal." He continues, "The flat top, especially, was often seen to be a platform, deliberately built to bring people closer to the skies. but new evidence is increasingly telling us that our Neolithic ancestors display an almost obsessive desire to constantly change the monument, to rearrange, tweak and adjust it. It's as if the final form of the hill did not matter, it was the construction process that was important. Dr. Leary added, "The most intriguing discovery is the repeated occurrence of gravel, chalk and stones, in different kind of layering, in ways that suggest that these materials and their different combinations had symbolic meanings." He continued, "We don't know what myths they are representing, but they must have meant something quite compelling and personal." For hundreds of years, archaeologists have investigated the hill. Damage was caused in the 1700s when antiquarians sunk a vertical shaft in from the top, and back in the 1840s, a tunnel was dug into the mound from the edge. In 1968, BBC Two filmed a new attempt to tunnel into the centre of the mound. But in 2002, it was discovered that the mound was beginning to sink, so the BBC tunnel was reopened, soil and rock samples were taken, the tunnel was filled in, and the mound has been sealed ever since. Nothing of great note has ever been found inside, no central burial that was expected, and this leads me to agree with some of the claims put forward by Jim Leary. Maybe the mound's form wasn't important. In fact, I'd go one stage further and say maybe the mound isn't what we think it is at all. The siting of the mound being in a valley, with its summit pretty much lower than the surrounding hilltops, means that it couldn't have been used as a major vantage point, or that it was seen from miles around. It sits in a really odd position, unlike the pyramids of Giza and other prominent man-made structures, which stand proudly for all to see. Apart from the mound, what else do we find in this specific place? Well, there is a huge excavated ditch immediately surrounding the monument, and I, like many others, speculate that this lowered area may have once been filled with water. Silbury Hill's surrounding ditch has a clear rectangular extension, and to me it is clear that this ditch at one time acted as a reservoir, starting small but growing in size as time went by and the population size swelled. Interestingly, in the early summer 2001, as the ditch dried out, a huge vegetation mark, straight-edged and some 10 metres wide, appeared to extend across the ditch floor for some 50 metres towards the mound. Its orientation, however, was curious, running diagonally across the ditch extension towards a position off-centre of the mound. The feature definitely appeared to be man-made, but why was it going to the mound? Geographically, the mound sits in a dip in the landscape, almost disguised by the surrounding folds in the hills, so it must be located there for a reason. Many are unaware, but the secrets of Silbury Hill began to be revealed in 2012. The summer saw continual rainfall, which slowly charged the depleted aquifers from the dry winter of 2011. But on the night of October 31st, Halloween celebrations in Avebury were swamped by what was described as a near-biblical deluge. The River Kennet burst its banks, and although the water eventually ran back off into the Kennet, a great volume of water must have seeped down into the bedrock chalk. This inundation was the trigger for part of Silbury's ditch to fill. It is important to note that the present southerly course of the Kennet, past Silbury, is artificial, moved uphill into a narrow artificial channel at the base of Weydon Hill, about 100 metres northeast of where it would normally flow. In early November 2012, in the weeks following the deluge, the original true River Kennet returned, a wide braided river flowing alongside its modern counterpart. Today, the River Kennet supplies no water at all to the Silbury ditch, but an ancient southerly route across the meadow may have done so. Silbury is situated on a confluence of two rivers, between the Winterbourne stream flowing south into the Kennet and the Beckhampton stream flowing east. The latter is fed by springs and only partly feeds the Silbury ditch. But as the rain continued in November 2012, fresh puddles appeared in the Silbury ditch, and 2 weeks later it was completely filled with water. The rain stopped in December, followed by a cold snap, but even with snow on the ground, the water in the Silbury ditch remained, and in some parts it was showing relatively warm temperatures of 10 degrees, even though the air temperature was just 3. 10 degrees is a temperature of spring water, and by the end of winter, the warm water temperature was noted throughout the entire lake. What was clear was that spring water now occupied the entire ditch. It was noted that springs were actually bubbling up beneath Silbury Hill and flowing westward beneath it. Investigation showed that springs were also popping up along the entire length of its western and southern banks. Some were almost level with the surface of the ditch water, whilst others up to a metre or so above it. Springs were also found in the East Ditch's southwestern corner. In total, an unbelievable 82 natural springs were found around the western ditch, and 7 in the east, with an unknown amount underneath the hill itself. There were also no springs anywhere else in the Silbury meadow. Silbury was, without doubt, a very special location within the landscape. When I started researching this video, I believed the ancient Britons were simply digging out a reservoir and piling the earth and chalk in one location, without any intention of building a monumental structure. But now we know that the hill actually sits on top of at least one natural spring. And that explains the huge vegetation mark seen in early summer 2001, which, as described earlier, was straight-edged and some 10 metres wide, and extended across the ditch floor for some 50 metres from the mound to the western part of the ditch. Maybe in the past, the only active springs at Silbury were around or under the hill, so maybe later people created the artificial channel to transport the water out from under the hill and into the outer reaches of the reservoir. To me, this presented a problem. Why would anybody build the largest man-made mound in Europe over a spring, and then dig out a channel to get access to the water? Why bother building a mound in the first place? Or why not build it 100 yards to the left or to the right, and keep the spring exposed so everybody had access to this important source of fresh, warm water? Does this make sense to you? And then I found out that close by there is another mound known as Silbaby. It is unexcavated and largely unknown, and is located midway between Silbury Hill and the road that runs from West Kennet to Avebury Henge. It has a profile similar to that of Silbury, and is larger than the average round barrow in the region. Amazingly, Silbaby Hill also sits directly on top of a natural spring, and there is an artificial spur that carries water from the hill to the nearby river. We have 2 conical hills close together, both built over natural springs, and both with man-made channels that divert water away. Silbury is made of earth, gravel and chalk, and apart from a few antler picks, there are no incredible finds associated with it. Springs were sacred and important in ancient times, and so building mounds over them just doesn't make any sense to me. And then it hit me. What if Silbury Hill is not totally man-made at all? What if it was originally a natural feature? The idea may be a little crazy, even for me, but the more I explored this hypothesis, the more it became feasible. We do have a lot of unknowns when we look at Silbury Hill in more detail. The nearby River Kennet has been artificially moved to where it once was, and the climate has changed considerably since the warm and wet Bronze Age when Silbury Hill was built, so we cannot say for sure how active the springs under the mound used to be. Although not seen in Britain, there are formations found around the world known as spring mounds. In southern Tunisia, in some geological situations, belts of spring mounds up to 25 or 30 metres high, the same size as Silbury Hill, straddle ancient shorelines. As geologists C.R. Roberts and C.W. Mitchell point out in a paper from 2016, spring mounds are circular, gypsiferous or calcareous, volcano-like structures fed by point sources of artesian water rising from aquifers. This actually reads like a description of Silbury Hill, and it is interesting to note that similar mounds have been found in America, Australia, Egypt and Iraq. In some mounds, a central well is occupied by a small pond with water conduits in the base, whilst others are dry and degraded, like Silbury Hill is today. In these latter examples, water is only present at depth. Interestingly, the stratigraphy of southern Tunisian spring mounds is made up of alternating layers of crystalline material, wind-blown sands, wash and splash deposits, and organic layers arranged in overlapping sequences, which dip outward from the water source. Sound familiar? This is similar to the inner, earlier phases of work we see at Silbury Hill. If the dates of Silbury are correct, it formed at the end of the Holocene maximum, when conditions in Britain got considerably wetter but still warm. So, there is a correlation between hyperwet conditions in Britain and the formation of Silbury Hill. Did the increase in precipitation activate the spring at Silbury, or was it only activated during specific times of flooding when the ground was hypersaturated? Do the earliest phases of Silbury's history relate to flood events that were bringing up and depositing material on the surface? In Australia, there are so-called exploding mound springs. These act like release valves for building water pressure in the underlying aquifer. They explode not just mineralised water, but also gravel and boulders, which all come from the rock layers below. Could Silbury be one such release valve from when Britain became wet at the start of the Bronze Age? So-called mud mound springs have also been noted on the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales, Australia. One example appeared for the first time in a flat field in 1989. Clay was being carried in suspension by water seeping to the ground surface where it has accumulated and formed a mound, and it continued for 3 years before groundwater conditions changed. The limited study of spring mound structures seems to show that they are built mainly from groundwater from aquifers rising to the surface through chimneys or fissures, and seeping through the overlying surface sediments at sharply defined points which may be related to fault zones or rock joints in the underlying limestones, which, in the case of Silbury, would be the underlying chalk. If correct, and if it is natural, the Silbury Spring Mound would not have escaped the attention of the ancient Britons, and it could well have been artificially worked, shaped, and certainly added to. But my natural interpretation for the earliest stages of Silbury Hill certainly explains the somewhat anomalous observations, including why the mound is situated over a spring or multiple springs, why there are repeating patterns and layering inside, why there has never been anything of note found inside, why the monument was constantly changing with no obvious structural plan, why it is located in an odd position compared to the surrounding landscape, and why there are 15 episodes of building over a long period of time, and why it wasn't just one consistent project. There will be many people who disagree with this theory, and various lines of evidence for a human origin will be put forward, but I don't doubt that humans would have had some interaction with Silbury Hill. In fact, I believe they built the later phases of the hill, the strong chalk walls and partitions infilled with chalk rubble. All indications show that people did build the later phases, but instead of some ceremonial mound, what if they were actually building a giant water tower? Maybe the hole in the top was always there from the very beginning. A large hill forming over a spring would have drawn great attention. People may well have worked it, tried to reshape it, or even remove it. They may have also tried to bore into it to access the water. We know that the ditch or reservoir is man-made, and the channel from the mound to the western portion of the ditch is certainly created by people. But although it is evidence, antler picks found at the top of the mound do not prove that humans created it in its entirety, and it is my belief that what they did was enlarge it. Enlarge a natural mound that was the result of a natural spring and turned it into a giant conical structure. It may sound somewhat unbelievable that Silbury Hill could be mainly natural, but if we look at the morphology of other spring mounds around the world, they do share many similarities. So why do we only have spring mounds in this specific part of the UK and not elsewhere? For a start, there may well have been more in the past that have been worked by humans. Maybe some were turned into burial mounds and are therefore assumed to be man-made, or, in the UK, maybe the geological conditions for their formation are only found at Silbury. I think that Silbaby Hill is the same as Silbury Hill, the difference being that Silbaby was never added to by humans. This is a brand new idea and one that cannot be proved in just one video, if at all. I will be taking this idea further by looking at the geology of the region, the hydrological history, climatology, as well as archaeology. The reason this hypothesis hasn't been on the table as a possible origin is, in my opinion, because it has always been assumed without question that the monument is man-made. Archaeologists have studied the site in great detail, but have geologists ever taken a closer look? Silbury Hill, whatever its origin, would have always been a focal point to the ancient Britons. They would have been drawn to it, they would have moulded it and excavated it, and I certainly believe they built onto it. It was a unique place within the landscape, home to an unusually high number of natural springs, with a conical structure that certainly would have looked iconic in the landscape. Silbury Hill is certainly an enigma, but maybe it is one created by nature and then turned into a large chalk water tower. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.